Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am delighted to be joined by Lee-Anne McAulay, author of the novel Echoes on a Fractal Line. Lee-Anne, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me, Colin.
Of course. So you are in Scotland. I'm over here in the United States. We know a little bit about the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715. We actually published a novel about it a few years ago. But for those who aren't as familiar, can you tell us a little bit about what that history is and how it plays a role in your novel?
Sure, of course. So in 1707, the story really starts in 1707 when the Act of Union happens, which creates the Kingdom of Great Britain and brings Scotland under the legislative control of the Westminster Parliament. So the Scottish Parliament is dissolved, but interestingly, the church and Scottish law remain separate, which is quite unusual. And Scotland gets a really raw deal with that, particularly around trade and levies. There was a lot of really bad feeling that was created around that. And then the Hanoverian King George comes to the throne and is really not popular with the Scottish nobles because they believed that James Stuart, the old pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie's dad, had a much stronger claim. So in the middle of all of this, you have a Highland sort of clan system at play in Scotland, whereby loyalty is to your clan first. That was still very much the way of life in Scotland at this point in time. That the feudal system that had been in place for so long had evolved and changed, yes, but it was still very much there. So the off-page antagonist of this novel is the sixth Earl of Mar, who is John Erskine, and his seat of power is in the area I live in here in Alloa, and Alloa Tower was his home. He had been the Secretary of State for Scotland as part of the British government. So he went from Secretary of State for Scotland in the British government to Jacobite rebellion leader in about 3 months. So it was quite a turnaround, and that earned him the nickname that a lot of people would know him by, which is Bobbing John, because of the way that people perceived he changed sides back and forth. Although actually, I'm not sure that is what happened, but there we go.
And tell us about the characters you use, Hazel and Lauren, to bring readers, convey that past for readers.
Yes. So Hazel and Lauren are in the modern day timeline of the novel, and they are historians who are trying to save historical properties from essentially from developers or from going into mothballs, and they conceive a project that's called Fractal Lines. And what they do is they explore the history of Alloa Tower to try and bring it to life for people and make it really relevant and exciting for people. And in the course of that, they uncover lots of the history of what's happening at Alloa Tower at that point in time. But then they also find a body where there really shouldn't be a body. Meanwhile, in the past, the characters there are living through the events that surround the 15 uprising.
So tell us more about the structure of the novel. It's a dual timeline. So how did you then transition between the two timelines and kind of keep those characters, the present Hazel and Lauren, and the past Janine and Myrid, is it? Keep them
Jeannie and Myra, yeah.
Jeannie and Myrid, so that they're kind of working together, even though they're centuries apart.
So it was I did this quite intuitively. I had set out thinking I would perhaps write quite a structured dual timeline where there would be so many chapters in the present and then so many chapters in the past. And as I wrote, it became clear that that wasn't the way this was going to go. It needed to be, I needed to really change when to the character who had the most emotional stake in the story at that point in time. So I wrote that quite intuitively and shifted between them so that the reader is always maybe a little step ahead of the characters in either timeline. The reader will have more of the information than either set of characters does as their stories play out, which kind of keeps the pace going a little bit, and keeps raising the stakes that little bit about who will find out what and when.
And you mentioned, you said here at Alloa Tower. So were you inspired to write the story because it's regional for you?
Yes, I'm very fortunate. I live in central Scotland, in a part of the world where we've got such a lot of history. We've got Wallace and Bruce, the stories that everybody knows, and Scottish Wars of Independence. Mary, Queen of Scots, James VI was born here. So there is a lot of history in this area, and actually it goes right back um, to the Picts and the Celts and the Romans. So that the sort of the northern frontier of the Roman Empire in Britain stops here. It was sort of here and no further. So there is so much history here. It's hard not to be inspired by it. But this story in particular was interesting to me because we don't know what happened at Alloa Tower during the uprising. We know the story of the uprising and the Battle of Sheriff Muir, but Alloa Tower holds quite a strategic position. It overlooks the River Forth, which is, if you could hold the River Forth, you could have a really good chance of holding Stirling Castle. And if you could hold Stirling Castle, you can hold the north of Scotland. Um, so it was a really strategically important part of the country during all of the Jacobite risings. So it just intrigued me that we didn't know what was happening in a place that I cannot for a moment imagine John Erskine was going to leave undefended. So
Can you talk a little bit more about your research and kind of discovering those things? Were you able to visit historic sites and get research assistance? What kind of books did you rely on? How much of it did you have to fill in gaps where you couldn't find out what really happened?
So I was very fortunate that the Alloa Tower is in the care of the National Trust for Scotland, which is fantastic. And they really look after historic properties here in Scotland. But all that remains of what used to be this massive palace, for want of a better word, is the tower now. It's the keep. So the people at Alloa Tower were phenomenal. They really helped me. They gave me access to the archives there. But when I started to sort of feel that this was the story I wanted to tell, I wrote to the current Earl of Mar and asked him if would he be okay with this. I didn't want to go digging around in the history books and not be polite and say, this is the story I'm going to tell. And he met with me a couple of times and was very generous with his time and his knowledge about his family tree and his knowledge about the motivations um, for John Erskine and what was happening at that time. And it was really interesting to me that he said it wasn't until he talked to me about this story that he realised he didn't know what was happening at Alloa Tower either. So James, Myra, Jeannie, all the characters in the past are fictional characters, but they are based around what I know life was like in this part of Scotland at that time. And for that research, I have the national museums and the national libraries. So I was able to go and look at lots of letters that were written um, between John Erskine and other nobles. I was able to sort of follow that trail and visit the battle site of Sheriff Muir, which was famously inconclusive battle. And both sides obviously claimed they won, but neither appeared to do that. So there was lots of options to draw on for the research.
Can you talk a little bit about the title? You did mention it was the name of the project of your characters, Hazel and Lauren. Uh, what's the significance of it for the story?
So the idea of a fractal in mathematics being a pattern that repeats, um, and I found that to be really true when I look at the stories of women throughout Scotland and throughout time. There are certain patterns that repeat. There are certain problems that we all come up against. It's part of the human experience. So for me, that was what was fascinating about this. And that's how I got to Echoes on a Fractal Line, is that these are the stories that are still repeating in Scotland now with, you know, independence is very much a live topic in Scottish politics at the moment. So that continues to repeat. Our national identity as a theme continues to repeat. But the experiences that both sets of women have during the events of the novel, there are echoes of that in each timeline. And that's something I'm always drawn to when I read historical fiction, is how much of that experience I can actually relate to, no matter when and where it's set.
And what exactly about that experience did you want to highlight for readers about the resilience of these women, the camaraderie? What exactly were you trying to show?
That that friendship and cooperation can exist even when the system and the context in which we're operating in seems to want to pit us against each other, and seems to want to draw on that competition between academics, between women, the tension around how women should form friendships with each other, and where that, what unites people really is when you're in the middle of something. Sometimes there's no other choice but to cooperate, even if you would really rather not in the moment. So that was something I wanted to just explore a little bit.
That's wonderful. Let's talk a little bit about your writing. Very eloquent prose. How did your own writing style develop over time, and when did you get to the point where you knew you wanted to write a novel?
So apparently, when I was 7 years old, I declared that was what I was going to do. I was going to write novels for a living, and I'm very lucky that I have a family who will support whatever crazy dream I decide I'm going to chase. My family will support that. But I was a reader first. I grew up with a real love of stories, and and I grew up reading and being read to fantasy novels when I was very young. My dad, who was in the Navy and away a lot of the time, was reading The Hobbit to us, and sometimes we would have to wait months for him to be able to pick the story up again when he came home. So growing up on these big epic fantasy novels of heroes and villains really, I don't know, it planted a seed within me. And then I was also very fortunate that I lived in a household where I could choose any book that was on the shelves. There was nothing, I was never told that's too old for you, or, put that back. So I read a lot of the classics, Little Women, and a lot of Bronte's novels, but I also read Terry Pratchett. And so I had quite a diverse experience as a reader, which, as I grew up, formed into this love of a story and fascination with how things work. So I did an English degree when I went to university alongside teaching, and I taught English for 19 years in one form or another. And so that allowed me to develop that love of how you teach people to write, how you bring out that creativity. And then when my children were getting a bit older, I thought, okay, it's time for me to do something for myself. So every day in the morning, I just set a timer for 5 minutes and I started to write. And it was something I used to do as a lesson starter with young people. Just 5 minutes of writing. It doesn't matter if what you write is gibberish. It doesn't matter if what you write is, I hate this stupid exercise. Why is she making us do this? Just write for 5 minutes. And when I did that myself, what I found was that these characters started to emerge, and this real longing to make it, to tell this story. So I then went on to writing short stories, and again set them in this area. I feel very rooted here, so I set my stories in this area and explored other aspects of the history of the area. And then, but that story wouldn't go away. These characters kept coming back. And it was a particular scene which takes place on the rooftop walkway of the tower with Lauren and Hazel looking out over all of this beautiful landscape and just taking in the enormity of everything they've just been through. That scene really stuck with me, and from that, those characters started to grow and develop and become this story.
And since the time that you thought up that scene or you met these characters, what was the process like for you as actually putting this all together into a first draft, into a final draft, into getting it published? Some authors it can take a decade. Some, they can do it in a year or two. What challenges did you come across?
I came across the challenge. I suppose I'm a busy working mum, and I was the head teacher of a school, a principal, as it would be in America. Um, so that was a huge challenge for me. And so it, finding the time to write, that became my time. Um, and I learned so much about myself. I thought that I would be somebody who liked to have everything planned out and have every single scene written out before I started to write, and that killed the joy for me. So I actually found, because I had the structure of the history to write to, so I knew what happened when in reality. So I always had the next kind of crisis point for the characters in 1715 to work towards. That was enough structure for me to just write. Um, so I wrote that first really messy, chaotic draft that then I refined. I joined a writing course and I refined that work through that writing course. And then when I handed it over to an editor, it had to be prized out of my hands. And I handed it over to an editor who said, "This is better than you think it is. This just needs a bit of love." Um, so that process, then the editing process, became the part I've really enjoyed. That taking that mess and finding the real bones of the story in it.
Tell me about your vintage writing bureau.
My vintage writing bureau. So it was my husband bought it for me. We'd seen it advertised on a local reselling site, and I'd always wanted one. And when I decided that I was going to write something quite substantial, I wanted something that was a real touch point for me, and this vintage writing bureau just became that. I'm actually sitting at it now. It became that touch point for me that I just love it. I find it quite an inspirational place to be. It helps me get into that flow state to write. I sit down, I light my candle, have my tea. More often than not, there's cake involved, and that's all part of the process that gets me into the place that I need to be to write.
And are you, well, I guess first I should ask, you said you were a teacher. Are you no longer doing that so you can focus on your writing, or are you doing something else?
So I stepped away from being a head teacher. I had 20 years. I'd been teaching for 20 years, and that felt like a nice round number to stop at. So I thought, well, it's now or never, really. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to jump again. So I took the best part of a year out, and really tidied Echoes up. And I now work part time for a fantastic charity, and I write. So I've got a much better work life balance. I feel like I'm in a really good place with it. So
And this is going to be a series? This is just the first in a series?
yes, this is the first in a series. There's plenty of history in Scotland for
Sure.
Lauren and Hazel to get their heads around. So
Well, Lauren and Hazel will stick around. Then do you move forward in time for the next novel?
we're going backwards in time for the next novel. And we're going to the Isle of Mull, which is on the west coast of Scotland. and is very beautiful, very, very beautiful island. And the story that intrigued me there, and sometimes you'll know this, Colin, that sometimes other people give you the ideas. You're not really looking for it, and somebody will tell you a story or they'll mention something, and you think, oh, that's it. So, what I didn't know was that during the Spanish Armada in 1588, one of the Spanish galleons was badly damaged in a storm and blew into Tobermory Bay on the Isle of Mull. And the clan chieftain Lachlan Moore MacLean, who is a quite a character, he said, "Okay, we'll repair your ship." And then, just as it was ready to leave, it blew up under mysterious circumstances. And there are two schools of thought. One is that Lachlan Moore MacLean himself blew it up, and the other is that it was one of Walsingham, Francis Walsingham of Queen Elizabeth's court, that the spy master, that it was his doing. And I thought, well, that's a story that's too good not to tell, isn't it? So I started to research that, and it's just so I'm in the editing process with that at the moment.
Well, it sounds very interesting and very fun that you doing that. Well, Lee-Anne, congratulations on Echoes on a Fractal Line, and just congratulations on making that transition. It sounds like you are thriving, and we definitely look forward to seeing more from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time as well.